And welcome back to another episode of AlphaCast. My name's Mike Winner, and I'm here as always with Dr. Bear Paul Lando up here on the beautiful, pristine Smith River on the border of California and Oregon in the great state of Jefferson, where freedom still reigns true. And today we are so pumped to have Andrew Kaufman back on the show. But Andrew Kaufman, MD, completed psychiatric training at Duke University Medical Center after graduating from the Medical University of South Carolina while earning a BS from MIT in molecular biology. But he is not your average physician. Andrew believes that the innate wisdom of your body can heal itself from almost any insult. He states, if you support your body's wisdom, you will return to vitality. This is exactly what we say. Andrew also recognizes that dis-ease in the modern era is largely due to the thousands of toxins we are exposed to each and every day. Dr. Kaufman has received international acclaim in recent months for shedding a different light on the alleged pandemic within a context of bioterrain medicine in which microbes are understood as ecobionts rather than pathogens. Andrew refers to his medical approach as medicamentum authentica, which means authentic medicine.
And I'm glad you mentioned medicamentum authentica, and I know it's difficult to pronounce for many people, so I apologize about that, but it is, from my perspective, really important to have a name and a symbol for my mission of, improving people's health that can't be subverted. And what it really refers to, what I mean by authentic medicine is what really allows your body to restore itself to health. Because it's not that as practitioners or physicians or healers or whatever term we want to use, we don't give something that heals the body. What we do is we give, something, and it might not be a substance, right? It could just be information, but that thing allows the person's body to heal itself. And because our bodies take care of everything that they need to maintain life, including recovering from an insult, which most likely would be toxic in nature, or perhaps traumatic, or perhaps a nutritional deficiency, or it could be a psychological issue as well. But our bodies have the ability, and they really are the only ones that have the ability to heal from those conditions. So the authentic medicine is to support that authentic ability of our body to heal itself. So, that's really my overall philosophy about that. And I want to just add one more important element. And I think specifically the 7 Hermetic principles seem to apply very appropriately, to healthcare and in the model that I conceptualize. And I think the most important of those is the law of cause and effect. And that for everyone who has a health issue, right, whether you call it a disease or an illness or a symptom, that there's always a cause for that effect. And generally speaking, the cause is something that person did. Now, not that they purposely tried to cause illness, but they inadvertently did, or maybe their parents made the decision for them when they were younger. And so it's really important because allopathic medicine, like our mainstream healthcare system, doesn't really even know the cause for most types of illness, right? They might say, well, it's probably due to a virus, right? They often say that when they don't know. And in fact, there was a major research effort by the United States government in the 70s. The war on cancer was all about trying to find viruses that cause cancer, and they came up short. But all the autoimmune disease, right? They say we don't know what causes it. Sometimes they do say something causes it, but it's actually not true at all. Like they say high cholesterol causes heart disease, and that's not true at all there. And it's pretty well known what really causes heart disease. So that one is really problematic. But I guarantee that there's always a cause. And in my experience, you can almost always figure out what it is if you ask enough of the right questions. So my approach would be to identify and then address the underlying cause, which most often is related to toxicity and or parasites, but can also be several other things that I previously mentioned. So, but if you're able to identify that cause and address it directly, then your body will reverse, the disease process, because it won't need to, because all of these illnesses that are manifest are actually your body trying to correct some problem underlying, and you just need to support your body correcting that. And, what's happened is over the last century, we've been dominated by this scientific materialist paradigm, in which germ theory is a major, it's like the biological component of. And what that did is it focused all of the last 100 years of research practically, aside from Béchamp and Bernard and Naissance and a few people who published in the early part of the century, to all of that research effort was really all about germ theory, which is based on faulty science and fraud. So now is a super exciting time, because we have this opportunity to start a new era of scientific discovery where we can step back from that materialist perspective and look at a new perspective where we could actually really gain a lot of understanding of the old wisdom. And it's really important, though, that there has to be a major shift in this paradigm, because if we're stuck in materialism, we're only going to, have a very limited ability to discover anything. And I'll give you an example of how this plays out, because you brought up energetic healing. And based on this materialism, right, we attribute all the properties of a substance to the physical matter of it. And when we're talking about biology and physiology, we're really talking about chemistry. Like, we kind of learn about this in graduate school and medical school as, the chemistry is what runs the whole body. And that's like physical molecules interacting with each other and exchanging energy, basically, right? But what we totally neglect is that all of those energetic exchanges also result in radiation of electromagnetic waves and in production of electricity. And in fact, we really already know, and it's widely accepted in biology, that for our cells to function, we need to maintain what's called a resting membrane potential, which is a voltage, right? So there has to be a more negative charge on one side of the cell membrane compared to the other. And this is absolutely crucial for life. And it's been taught to us that the energy to maintain this voltage is generated chemically, purely chemically, from ATP. Now, this is still, by the way, the widely accepted paradigm for biology, for molecular biology, so that our mitochondria metabolize and produce enough ATP to drive this ion pump on the membrane that keeps this voltage going. Unfortunately, what's happened is that some scientists have calculated how much energy that would actually take, and they determined that it was more than the mitochondria could actually produce at full capacity. So if they did that, the cells would not be able to conduct any other activity whatsoever, and they would die. So it's known now through, straightforward mathematics, right, based on thermodynamic properties. So this is just, plug into an equation and get the answer, and no, it couldn't make that much energy. That there has to be another theory. And so Gilbert Ling would be someone that you'd want to read if you want to really get into the nitty-gritty of this. But essentially, there's things that we don't really understand at all, and it really has to do with the properties of water and of electromagnetism in order to understand how this system really works to maintain the voltage. And in order to consider that, you have to get away from materialism. And, even though there have been so many experiments to really prove that this is true, it's still not widely accepted. So that's why we need an event like this going on now, like such an extreme event like the pandemic, to shake up, all of us into realizing that the science that we've been relying upon is not valid, and that there are major, major shortcomings, even at the most fundamental level. Like germ theory is a very kind of fundamental argument, right? So much is based upon it. Just like gravity is a fundamental principle, right? That so much of mechanics is based upon gravity. So we have to get down at that basic fundamental level in order to rethink things, and then we can have an amazingly productive era of scientific inquiry. And this is something that in as much as I have the ability to kind of promote this new era, like this is really what one of my main goals is.
Yeah, and isn't it incredible that a lot of sacred cows are really dying right now, and a lot of just what we think is concrete truth is being dispelled. For instance, you could look at the heart. The heart, has been calculated more recently that if you look at the amount of pressure that would have to be generated within a left ventricle to push it all the way through the terminal capillaries, that amount of pressure would explode. So what we're now understanding, the heart doesn't even work as a pump the way we're taught in medical school. And in fact, it's an energy vortex.
Hey, Andy, we're seeing this system fracture and kind of break down right in front of our eyes with this supposed cerveza pandemic here. And, there's this article I shared with you last night that you read that once more and more start to wake up to just how silly germ theory is and how just how out of scope this has gotten, how much this has grown off this really faulty, corrupt, fraudulent, ground floor of faulty science, how we have literally, I would say almost $1 trillion industry based on it. It's laughable when you start looking at the mainstream articles about the pandemic. It's just outright, it's just crazy how much of the illusion is being shattered right now. And so I don't know, maybe while we're waiting for Bear, we could quickly rip through this article unless there's something else you'd like to talk about. But I think
Mike, I just want to make one quick point to emphasize what you said, because you said, right, if you read the articles, and one of the most important things is that almost no one has actually read these papers. A lot of people criticize me and, say my opinion is wacky and I, disagree so vehemently with what's widely accepted. But I want to know, out of those people who widely accepted this narrative about viruses, like how many of them really looked at the paper and took the time to figure out what it means? Because when I did that, I was really blown away, because it was not what a paper looked like that I was taught to write a paper, and I've published several papers and I've been a peer reviewer, and I've read hundreds and hundreds of papers in my career. And it was just astonishing to see that they did not follow the scientific method, like no control experiments. I don't know how you get an article published without a control group. I certainly would have never been able to be published. In fact, when I submitted manuscripts, I remember the peer reviewers were so picky, even when I had really solid statistics, they still found ways to criticize it. So not having a control experiment, which is like something you learn in grade school, when you learn the scientific method, is really astonishing. So, for anyone out there who, thinks that I'm really off base in what I'm saying, I would really encourage you to go look at the papers and try to figure out what they mean. And, maybe do that and then look at some of my presentations where I try to explain them to help you figure it out, because it's not so easy, to figure out all the aspects. And I am trying to put out more material to go over various parts of the experiments. Like I'm working on a paper right now to explain the genome sequencing techniques.
Yes.
And, once I expose that a little more, it's just quite astonishing that they're basically just creating a genome out of nothing, like of an organism that doesn't exist. I'd be happy to go through this a little bit, because it is kind of an interesting technology. But for the genome sequencing, and this, a lot of people have made the argument to me that this is the most compelling evidence to say that there is an actual virus. But what they do is they use this technique called next generation sequencing, or NGS is how they often write it in the papers. And so I did some homework and looked into this technique. And you can actually, if you search it on YouTube, you'll find many videos, because this is a commercial technique, and there are companies making devices that semi-automate this, and they want to sell those. So they basically are advertisements that explain the technique, geared towards, people that work in laboratories. So it's very useful for this purpose to educate us. And what this technique is it's basically a way to very quickly, in a highly efficient manner, sequence the entire genome of an organism. But what it's designed for is to do that with an organism that has a known genome sequence. So let's say, for example, there is like a disease in an animal, like a certain type of cancer, like let's say bladder cancer in monkeys. And you want to find, is there a genetic mutation that's associated with this bladder cancer? So what you do is you would take that monkey, take a sample from the monkey that only has monkey cells, so it's pure sample, extract the DNA from there, and then run it through this procedure. And what this procedure does, instead of like taking each chromosome and sequencing it end to end, because it may have hundreds of thousands or even millions of base pairs in there, it chops them up into smaller pieces and then puts them on a two-dimensional substrate, like a piece of paper, for example, and attaches one end so that they're all basically, you get this like matrix of these little beads hanging off the paper, and they can sequence them all at the same time. So it cuts down the time in a major, major way. Like you could do it in a couple of days instead of weeks. And then what you do after all the sequences of those short strands occur, and those are chopped up in a predictable way with certain restriction enzymes, then you put all those sequences reference genome sequence of the monkey, which is known, and reconstruct it. And then it finds any sequences that indicate a mutation, so they don't match the reference genome of monkeys that are healthy. And they would say, okay, this could represent a mutation that causes the cancer. And then they can do further studies to confirm that. Okay, so you see, two critical things to using this powerful technique is, one, that you start with a pure sample that only has the genome of one organism. And on the back end, that you have a reference genome of that organism to compare it to. So one, you know that you've got the correct sequence. And then two, so you could find any mutations that you may be looking for. And it uses, like I said, computer software to reconstruct all of the sequences from these fragments into one long sequence. So it's a very powerful technique for that type of application, and it's a good technique for that. The way it's used in this situation with this unknown virus is very, very problematic, because one thing, the sample that they use to do the sequencing is not a pure sample. So in other words, they never did an experiment where they isolated and purified viral particles from a sick person and then have just that genetic material. If they started with that, they wouldn't even want to use this technique. They would want to use the end-to-end sequencing in that case, because there's nothing to compare it to after the computer reconstructs it. So if you want to get it accurate, if the genome should be one strand of RNA, you can just sequence that end to end. It's a technique called micropore sequencing. And if you had a purified viral particle and you did that, then you could say that that is the genome of that particle. And that would be 100% accurate. But that's not what they do, because they've never purified the particles. So what they do is they have a sample of lung fluid. Now that has RNA, because they're starting with RNA and they're going to turn it into DNA for this case, because they think that the viral particles have RNA as their genetic material. So any cell that's in that lung fluid sample, and it could be lung cells, immune cells, bacteria cells, fungal cells, et cetera, and then all kinds of particles like exosomes and necrotic bodies and things like that. Any of genes that are being expressed in any of those cells are going to be present as RNA. And then there's going to be also other types of RNA like transfer RNA and microRNA that have other functions. So in that sample, you're going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of sources of RNA. So when you sequence those in fragments, how do you really know what the source of all of those are? Now, some of them you might have specific probes that you pre-identified as being viral, but you can't have that for all of them because we're talking about somewhere around, they say it's 30,000 or 40,000 base pairs is the genome length. So it's pretty big numbers, not as big as a human, but computationally speaking, it's a lot of number crunching. So then so they put an impure sample, they get sequence of 1,000 fragments, or actually in one experiment there were 20,000 fragments that they sequenced. And then the computer software combines those fragments into one strand. But here there's a lot of error introduced because there are gaps that don't overlap in the sequences. So they just fill those in from a computer library. Like basically they're not part of the real whatever they're looking at, they're just from a database. So it's like they're imaginary sequences. And then how do they know the order of them is correct? Because once they assemble this into one strand, there's no reference genome to compare it to. So how do they know it's correct or what it actually comes from? And this is why you see different labs that do this from different parts of the world. They have different sequences and they're even different lengths. In one paper I saw that they specifically reduced the link to make it match with the results of another paper. But how do you just throw out sequences that you sequenced? It's like, that's not scientific. That's, just trying to get a result that you want and doing whatever it takes to get that result. So they explain that the sequences are different from place to place because they say it's a viral mutations. But there's no evidence of that. Right? That's just a convenient excuse or, a convenient justification. But really, it's just because they're not actually making a real genome. They're doing a sort of Frankenstein theoretical genome construct based on a theoretical virus that's never been purified, so it's proven to, exist as what it is. They say it is. So really, this whole method is just all subterfuge and misinformation.
So, Andrew, my question is, anybody with any medical training can follow what you're talking about, and I believe even people without medical training would be able to at least follow your logic. You lay it out brilliantly. So the question is, why aren't more doctors or every doctor seeing through speaking out? Of course, we understand that a lot of them don't because there's a heavy price to pay. But there's still a lot of, some of my colleagues that I talk to that just can't connect the dots. So what's the disconnect there?
Yeah, well, that's, it's a great question. I think there are a couple of things operating there. One is just kind of the cognitive dissonance that, like, if I challenge this, then I can't continue to be a doctor in the same way. And, then what's going to happen to my life? Is my family going to break up? Am I going to go bankrupt? How will I pay back my student loans? That kind of thing. So you just stay away from it. So that's one part of it. And another part of it is what I said earlier. That's just how many people have actually read one of these articles. There was a doctor, a relatively mainstream doctor, but someone who's been somewhat critical of how the pandemic is managed and who wanted to debate me about, whether this virus exists and causes the disease. So I started a conversation and he brought up that the genome has been sequenced, and he sent me a link to GeneBank, right, which is the government database of like genomes that have been sequenced, and it was published there. But I said, well, do you know how that sequence was determined? And, I think that for most doctors, there's just an assumption that if it's on GeneBank, the National Institutes of Health, they wouldn't mislead us. I can trust it. why would I look into the methodology? And by the way, I couldn't find where on the Gene Bank website that they describe the methodology at all. They do reference some published papers that describe it, but it's unclear which one they actually used to for the sequence that they publish. So, it's like the devil is really in the details. And, it took me a bit of research to figure out how this next generation sequencing worked. It's not like I just looked at the first paper and I was like, oh, aha, because they write it in a coded language that you don't know. And even if you're a molecular biologist publishing, you still don't know the virology language. They use their own language, and they change the meaning of words. Like they use the word isolation even in the title of their papers, but they don't isolate anything, right, by the English language definition, which means to separate from other things. So you have to learn that when virologists use the word isolate, what they mean is actually grow it in a toxic cell culture. And I don't know how they use the word isolate to describe that, but that's what it means. So when you read that in a paper, you have to substitute, grow in a toxic cell culture. And then you can understand what they're talking about. So I had to invest significant, time and energy to learn this language so that I could read these papers and actually figure it out. And then once you figure it out, you see, right? Like Mike, you mentioned, anyone can understand this, once I break it down. It's just they make it very inaccessible. And really, I think that's all that I've been doing in my time in this world, is like taking this coded language of science and just explaining it so that an average person can understand it, because science should be accessible to an average person. It's really not above or beyond our intellectual abilities, but we've been sort of brainwashed, if you will, to think that we can't understand science and math. I mean, the concept is not that hard. It's just all of the packaging that it's wrapped in makes it seem impenetrable.
I was going to say that Stefan Lanka recent article, I'm sure you're aware of that, Andrew, where he kind of breaks this all down. And
Stefan's work in this area has been so crucial, because he does have that insider's perspective, and he's the one that encouraged me to look at some of these issues, by the way, that led me to spend the time figuring them out. But he already figured out what was the most important thing to look at, and that was really useful to talk to him to clarify some things. And I was inspired there to really dig into some of these areas to help expose them. So yeah, that is a great resource to look at for sure. I wish I wish he were closer.
Yeah.
But maybe I'll be able to get over to Europe someday and interview him in person.
You kind of got a sense of what he was saying there, right? In terms of,
yeah.
I think, Bear, what he was really trying to encapsulate is why we're at now with MDs, and how it's not necessarily these. I mean, most MDs really mean well, and they got into this job some got in to make a bank load of money, but a lot that I know of got in because they have a passion for science, a passion for wellness, want to help, want to be a member of their society, and in a way that is, helping man be healthier. And unfortunately, there's a whole infrastructure of really scientism that is the foundation of everything that is really getting in the way of true health.
Well, the Rockefeller was really smart because, and we're talking about, the original Rockefeller back in the early 20th century, because the way that he infiltrated the medical system was to go after medical schools. Because if you control the education, then all of the future physicians are going to basically be educated how you want them to be, and they're going to practice how you want them to be. So it really comes down to this. They don't teach you any useful ways of helping people heal in medical school. They only teach you basically, the cut, burn, poison model of pharmaceuticals, surgery, and radiation. And it's very, very heavy on pharmaceuticals. So that's really the only approach that you have in your toolkit when you get out. And then they basically give you license to use those pharmaceuticals, even in situations where they're not technically supposed to be used for. And that's what your residency is about. In other words, it emboldens you. Like, for example, with in child psychiatry, which is a subspecialty of psychiatry, they are the ones by far prescribing the most drugs to kids in terms of like the number of drugs per kid. Now they don't, most kids are prescribed from primary care doctors, so not all of them make it to child psychiatrists, but among psychiatrists, they basically feel the most comfortable loading children up on meds because they did that special training, and that's what it was really about. But what it really should be about is understanding, childhood development and family dynamics, and that is really what could probably be helpful to the kids. So the doctors, even if they went to medical school and had the best intentions and were the most altruistic people around, they just don't get any of the knowledge or tools to really help people. So the way that I went about, developing this knowledge and skill set is by doing it on my own, and I kind of put aside what I was taught to do as a psychiatrist and, general physician, and just studied as much as I could. And it was really more difficult because there's not any standardized curriculum that I'm aware of that I would fully trust. I know there are curricula for like naturopathic schools and such, but that wasn't something I had easy access to. So I had to stumble around and find basically other practitioners who are successful and consume as much of their material, but it didn't really have a theoretical basis. So I had to figure that out on my own. And that's what led me to bioterrain theory. And then I realized once I learned that actually what I had learned was successful in terms of how to support someone's healing was actually based on the terrain theory model. So I already had, through my own observation, and I think this is a critical aspect of science that's accessible for everyone, is to observe with your own eyes and ears, like, the sort of zetetic approach. And so I saw people use these techniques and get better, and get better from things that are supposed to be not curable. And so I knew that it was real because I saw it with my own eyes happen, in real time. And then when I learned about terrain theory, I realized that all of those things that I had recommended or had learned were successful fit quite neatly into the terrain theory model. And so that's when I knew it was really important. So it kind of had this empirical validation for me, even though I can't point to, 100 randomized controlled trials that validate it. But all of the randomized controlled trials that say antidepressants work, I've never seen one person in my practice, and I've seen way, way more people take antidepressants than I've seen do natural healing. Not one of them recovered or was cured that I could attribute it to that medicine. So there's this big mix match, between what is peer-reviewed scientific evidence and what's going to be taught to medical students and PAs and nurse practitioners and dentists and all of those people, and then what's actually really valid science. And so this is the main problem that you have with most doctors. And of course, they don't realize, perhaps because it's too threatening or because they're just too busy to look into it, or they're not really paying attention, that what they're doing is not helping people. And in fact, all you have to do really is look at a couple of articles, that were published by Johns Hopkins and in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And you'll see that at least the third leading cause of death is from prescribed healthcare, like from drugs given as prescribed and from what they call medical errors, which is not really even errors if you look at the definition. So just from those two numbers, you have the third leading cause of death is from our healthcare system itself. And yet, if you surveyed, 100,000 doctors, I might be the only one who knows that out of all of them. Maybe there's a couple of others. So, and even though those articles are published in mainstream media, right? It's like, it's probably, given one story and put on page, 42 in the back, so that only a few people see it who happen to be looking for that or found out about it. And there are other ways to do this analysis, by the way, that show healthcare is the leading cause of death in the country, over 1 million people a year. And you can do that even just by taking the Medicare annual report, where it does list how many, what they call iatrogenic deaths, which is caused by healthcare. And if you extrapolate that number to the general population, it's over 1 million deaths a year. So now that's not the most accurate way of measuring this. I don't want to give a false impression like these numbers are approximate, but they indicate a serious, serious problem that is completely overlooked. Like, there is no initiative from any private or public entity that is trying to reduce the number of deaths caused by healthcare. Not one real effort. There may be some watchdogs and regulatory agencies, but they're not really addressing this at all, and they're not acknowledging it at that scale. They would focus on smaller things like hospital-acquired infections. That's just one little part of this picture.